used to fight against the church. And yet when God grabbed him, he didn't consult a single human being on what he was about to preach, on what he was about to teach. He didn't go to Jerusalem and say, okay, Peter, tell me what you know about Jesus. He didn't go down there and say, okay, James, you're the Lord's brother. Tell me a little bit about what you know about him. Tell me some stories about when he was 5. What was he like as a kid? Did he have ADD or was he calm? He didn't ask any of those kinds of questions about Jesus' backstory. He didn't go back to Jerusalem to find out all the nitty-gritty or to figure out if his teaching was correct. Paul claims that his teaching is entirely from God. And here's the first thing, if you're taking notes, the first thing to jot down. Paul says, you've got to know, Galatians, you've got to know that no one messed with my message. What I preached to you in Galatia, no one touched. No one messed with it. It came from God directly to you. No human hands got on that. Now, as you think about that, you got to think, man, that guy's kind of cocky. I mean, he's kind of arrogant, don't you think? Here's Peter. Peter is the one that Jesus looked at and said, you're Peter. You're the rock. And on this rock, I'm going to build my church. And then there's James, the half-brother of Jesus himself, who's been there faithfully in the Jerusalem church ever since day one. He knows Jesus better than anyone else knows Jesus, right? I mean, these are the guys you would want to talk to. And Paul's like, I don't need them. Whatever they were doesn't matter to me. God doesn't pay attention to outward appearances. On the one hand, you would say, man, Paul seems arrogant. But it's very, very important that you recognize Paul has a message that he is declaring has never had human hands on it. Paul is saying that his message comes directly from God himself. Now, how could he make such a claim? Now, of course, on the one hand, it's just important for us to recognize that for Paul, what people say doesn't matter. Is that true for us? Can we say the same thing? What people say doesn't matter to us? For Paul, people's status doesn't matter. He says, it doesn't matter to me if someone seems to be a leader. It doesn't matter to me. Can we say the same thing for us? Well, I guess what we really need to do is we need to investigate Paul's message. Because, see, it all boils down to whether or not we think Paul's message actually did come from God, right? So here you go. We're going to go back to verse 11. So go back there with me, Galatians chapter 1, verse 11, and we're going to try to analyze Paul's message and where he got it. Because he claims no human hands touched this message. So we have to figure out where he really got it. And so go back to verse 11. He says, I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel I preached is not something that man made up. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Okay? Now, all we know about Paul's revelation from Jesus Christ is as he was on the way from Jerusalem to Damascus, a bright light appeared to him, knocked him off his horse, and said, I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting. You need to go into Damascus, and there you will be taught what you must do. And so all we know about this direct revelation moment was that he saw Jesus. Paul doesn't tell us later on in some other passage or some other book or anywhere else, he doesn't tell us that he had another revelation from Jesus where Jesus sat down across the table and said, let me tell you all the things you're supposed to teach people. He didn't have that. He had this one momentary encounter that we know about, this one momentary encounter where he saw Jesus and was convinced that Jesus had come back to life from the dead. But we have to put that vision, that moment, in order to understand what it meant for Paul, we have to put that moment in the context of who Paul was. So keep reading. Verse 13, he said, you've heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God, tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many Jews of my own age and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. What we know about Paul is that he was a Pharisee, but he wasn't just a normal Pharisee. Paul was a super Pharisee. He was like the best of the Pharisees. He was dude Pharisee. I mean, Paul's teacher was a man named Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the number one teacher, the number one rabbi of Paul's day. And Paul was the number one student of that number one teacher. So that means that Paul was in line to be the number one dude in all of Judaism when it comes to Pharisees. And if you don't know much about Pharisees, here's what you need to know about Pharisees. Pharisees believed in something. They believed that if we live by the law, if we are pure, if we follow everything God tells us to do, then the end will come. The Pharisees were firmly convinced that all the promises God made in the Old Testament about the end, that the king would rise up from the line of David, that a priest would rise up from the line of Aaron, that a prophet would rise up just like Moses, that these people would come to the surface and they would proclaim this new kingdom, the end of the age, and God would judge all of his enemies. That's what the Pharisees believed. All they needed to do was be perfect, and God would do his part. Small task, right? Let's just be a little bit more perfect. So Paul was the super Pharisee. He was the closest to that perfection of anyone. So, you can imagine how upset the Pharisees were when they heard what Jesus said. Here are a couple things that Jesus said. Jesus said, "You've heard it said, but I say to you," and he said this a lot. He said, "You've heard it said that if you commit adultery, that's a sin. But I say to you, any man who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart." And the Pharisees are like, "Wait a minute, you're getting too soft on this, Jesus. The law says don't commit adultery. Jesus, don't start making up your own laws. It's hard enough to keep the ones we've got. Don't make up new ones." Jesus also said, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, because you strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel." He says, "You would tithe a tenth of your mint and your spices and your herbs, but you don't take care of the poor around you." He says, "You guys are deserving of hell." That's what the word woe means. You're in danger. Watch out. Okay, so the Pharisees didn't like that so much. He also said this. Jesus said at one point after reading Isaiah 61, the first few verses from 61, he said, "Today, this is fulfilled in your hearing." And you know what he left out? He left out a phrase that says the day of vengeance of our God is coming on you. He read this stuff up to vengeance and then just left out the vengeance part. But he said, today I'm the one who's fulfilling these words. And yet he's the guy who's teaching against this strict interpretation of the law. What's going on there? The Pharisees did not like him. And finally, he said this. He said, "The kingdom of God is among you." The kingdom of God is among you. That doesn't fit with the Pharisees. Let me show you a diagram here. If you're taking notes, you might want to draw this diagram down on your paper, because on this diagram, this is the way the Pharisees viewed the world. This is the way the Apostle Paul viewed the world before he encountered Jesus. And what it was that we live on this timeline, and at some future point, there's going to be an event. We'll get to that. But what we need to do now is we need to live lives of increasing purity, more and more holiness, closer and closer to God's will, obeying His law more and more perfectly. And then if we do our job well, there's a future moment in time when the Messiah will come. And He will come, and there will be a climactic moment where the Messiah takes charge, where He sets up His kingdom, where He establishes His rule, and He eliminates all opposition. And then, from that moment on into the future, the Jews will enjoy a new kingdom, a resurrection of the nation of Israel. That's the Pharisee belief. That there is the need for increasing purity, this climactic moment when the Messiah comes back, when the Messiah comes, and then the new kingdom is ushered in, and all of God's enemies are wiped out. Okay? So Paul believes that. But you'll notice what happened with Paul. He didn't meet a Messiah who conquered the world. He ran into a man named Jesus. Paul met the resurrected Jesus. So he was a super Pharisee, that's the first thing. Then the next thing is that he met a resurrected Jesus. Just to remind you of the context, here's the map. On this map, you've got Galatia is that red area, and then Antioch is where Paul really developed in his Christian teaching. And Antioch is he's writing the book of Galatia as he's traveling from Antioch down to Jerusalem. But years before he was in Jerusalem, he was the Pharisee, a super Pharisee, mind you, in Jerusalem. And while he was in Jerusalem, that's where he was getting his training. He was in Jerusalem the same time Jesus was in Jerusalem. The same time Jesus was in that area. And since Paul was a super Pharisee, he knew everything that was going on. He knew what was happening with Jesus. He knew what Jesus was teaching. He might have even been there in the council when Jesus was condemned to death. He might have been one of the voices in the audience shouting, "Give us Barabbas, crucify Jesus." Paul might have been there. He knew who Jesus was. He didn't need to be taught about Jesus' life because he had been there. But then the Christian movement begins, and he decides it's time for me to amp up my zeal. And he's traveling from Jerusalem to Damascus, and it's on that road when Jesus meets him and says, "I am Jesus." And Paul's like, "You mean you're not dead? You mean you're alive?" I'm a little freaked out by that. You know, that here is this guy that I saw killed, that I had a participatory effort in making him dead. He's a Pharisee. He knew the story of the empty tomb. He just believed the story that everybody was telling about it in the day, that the disciples had gone and stolen the body. That was the story. That was the story the Pharisees told. That's what Paul believed. He thought, he knew the tomb was empty. But now he's seeing the guy who used to be in it. And then he tells us this very interesting phrase. He says, "I went to Arabia." Arabia. You know, I'm not aware of any part in the entire Bible where anyone does anything in Arabia, except for this verse right here. I'm not aware of any time where God's people ever show up in Arabia, but I know something about Arabia. It's dry and it's a desert. So here's the deal, okay? Paul says, "I just encountered Jesus. My whole world has been flipped upside down. What do I do now?" And his response is, "I'm going to go to the desert." Here you go. Here's the blanks to write down. Paul studied in the desert. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert before he started his public ministry. Moses spent years in the desert. And then the people of Israel spent years more in the desert. Paul's like, "Dude, I got to get away. I've been trying to kill these people. I've been trying to wreck this thing that's going on, and now I've met Jesus. I need to get away." Now, all we know about where Paul got his message